Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And I know it's the end of the day, so I'll try and be quick and not too boring. So our project that I'm presenting on behalf of all the team is called GBV-MIG, Violence Against Women, Migrants and Refugees. Just to present the research project quite quickly, we had 7 country partners, you can see there. I'm not going to list all of the researchers because there are a lot. There were PIs in each country, plus a lot of postdoc researchers. So really thank you to all of the colleagues who participated. And really, I want to acknowledge here also all the participants in our research, and especially the migrant and refugee women who agreed to be interviewed and talk about their experiences, because that was really an integral part of the research and very important. And also thank you to the funders, obviously. So there are a lot of objectives there. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to summarize. The idea of our project was to understand the legal, political, socio-economic factors which create situations of vulnerability to gender-based violence in the context of migration. So, and across these different countries, we wanted to identify how and why particularly women, become vulnerable or put into situations of vulnerability to gender-based violence. And then if they do experience gender-based violence, what services there are for them, how they can access these services or not access these services, and also their own strategies and their own agencies and strategies, if and when, first for avoiding GBV, and then if they do experiences, what strategies might they use. So here are the research questions. We looked at legal and policy frameworks and how they contribute to risks of GBV. Also media, political discourses about migration and about GBV, and how particular framings also create contexts of vulnerability or contexts where women who have experienced GBV can't access help or are stigmatized. We looked at different services available, and we looked at how women themselves strategize and act to address risks and also the consequences of sexual and gender-based violence. And then we had a lot of questions around theoretical questions about theorizing vulnerability, and I won't go into all that here, but we understand, just to summarize, we really wanted to understand vulnerability not as linked essentially to any identities or social categories, but vulnerability is being created within a particular socio-economic, legal and political context. And we used what we called a situated intersectionality framework. So again, seeing intersectionality not as crossing oppressions of different, categories, but actually looking at intersectionality as the way people were located within different axes of discrimination and axes of inequality in different geographical, social contexts. So what we really wanted to avoid is clearly essentialism and essentializing women and political fragmentation. And just one remark, we talked about women, and we had also a long debate, because this is obviously research on gender, and we talked at great length. We know that men also experience gender-based violence, but we looked at all the previous research that had been done, and we still estimate that women and people who identify as women, we understand women in a very in an open way as anyone who identifies as a woman. So we believe that people who identify as women are still more likely to experience gender-based violence, and that's why, while we don't want to say that men don't experience GBV, but we concentrate in our project on women. So just these are some of the quotes from different countries and from different people who were interviewed for the research. Again, I'm not going to read it all out because I don't want to be too long, but it points to the fact that the lack of legal status, lack of accommodation, the way that refugees and migrants are perceived, all create situations of insecurity and vulnerability for these women. So in terms of our research, our results, the first thing we thought about the results from all the countries. I'm going to summarise. I'm not going to go country by country. I'm just going to try and give a cross-country summary and give some examples. So we found that these issues were invisibilised. So people don't speak about these issues relating to gender-based violence in the context of migration, and they're not on the policy agenda. There's a persistence. So there's a real, like, in terms of, you know, when we went to do interviews with policymakers, they really didn't talk about these issues very much, and it was something that was really a blind spot. Although we know that there is we discovered there are huge problems of gender-based violence in the context of migration, but there's a real normalisation of gender inequality and gendered violence. For example, there's real expectation now that migrants who pass through Libya on the way to arrive in the EU will have been victims of sexual violence, and somehow, because it's so accepted, it's kind of become normalised in a way, which is terrible things to say, but it seems the case. And also the discourses on immigration and the more and more securitized and restrictive discourses on immigration also push these issues off the policy agenda and mean that they're not actually something which is talked about. And we really wanted to, what we want to underline in our results, in the way that this violence is systematic and structural. It's not isolated incidents, and it's a real result of political, economic, and legal structures in the countries that we were looking at, which create these situations of violence. And also there's a lack of understanding of intersectional positionalities. So really a lack of understanding also, for example, of the operation of racism and colonialism in attitudes and in practices towards migrants, which also create forms of violence. Many of the understandings were culturalist or racist. So, for example, we found really like a big focus on FGM or forced marriage. So when we went to interview in France, we tried to interview policymakers. They said, yeah, we're doing loads of things on GBV or FGM, but no, on FGM or on forced marriage, but they didn't talk about the wider problems. And the fact in Paris, one of the things we found, that the systematic lack of access to accommodation was the main thing which pushed women into positions of vulnerability, and they didn't want to talk about that. They just wanted to talk about their latest initiative on FGM. And similarly, and which also echoes what a colleague from Belgium was saying, medical providers who we talked to, or medical personnel, will say, oh yeah, we're going to provide reconstruction for migrant women who've been experienced FGM. But I mean, in the context when they didn't have any job, they didn't have anywhere to live, they didn't have any money, you know, the last thing they probably need is reconstruction surgery. So it was a real, you know, culturalist and problem, creating that issue and ignoring all the others. There are other examples from other countries. So in Ireland, the researchers talked about the discourse of a citizenship referendum, which looked about the way, like all these allegations that pregnant women come and have babies to get citizenship, and that's, you know, a current theme, a kind of racist and anti-migrant theme. In Norway, migrant mothers who are victims of domestic violence are called uncooperative, and this is done in a very racist and culturalist way. And then we had our researchers in Israel talked about the ethno-nationalist understanding of citizenship as being related to being a Jewish state, which denies all rights to migrants and asylum seekers, and again leaves them in a hugely vulnerable legal position because they have no rights. In many contexts, women find themselves legally dependent on a male partner still, and they might be worried to report violence because they think that they're going to lose their legal status if they report. So if you report, then your legal status is tied to a partner, then you're worried about losing your legal status, or that you might be separated from your children. So in Canada, where they have the private sponsorship scheme, the sponsor could also be the perpetrator of violence, and that leads to huge issues. So, and then there are all the problems with family reunification and having to stay with the partner for a long time. So all of this creates legal dependency, and then, again, women are rendered vulnerable, and if they are victims or if they are experiencing violence, they can't leave, or they feel they can't leave. There are many obstacles in access to services for women who have experienced violence, so the lack of translation interpretation services, the failure to provide basic information on rights and services available, and a lot of disbelief and distrust about women's claims of GBV, especially in the asylum process, where it's seen like they're making it up to take advantage of the system and to gain asylum. And many claims on the basis of gender-related persecution are rejected. The services can be closed to people with no legal resident status. Not having papers closes a whole load of services to you. And there's a lack of coordination between many countries, between welfare and judicial systems. The issue, as I said, of housing or accommodation is a huge one. So many countries raise this issue of people who are arriving, women who are arriving, who have no access to accommodation or housing and are sleeping on the streets, which obviously puts you in a hugely vulnerable situation. In France, we had the situation where women who had just given birth actually stayed, and they had to live in the hospital because they had nowhere else to live, and then eventually the hospitals pushed them out onto the streets, so they were on the streets with newborn babies. So that makes people vulnerable to violence, and also to sexual transactional sex. There's a lot of transactional sex because women are offered housing in return for sexual relations. In Ireland, there's a special law called the habitual residence condition, which means that migrant women have to stay in a certain place and they can't move around, which means that they can't access social assistance and places of refuges. And also in Ireland, they have the direct provision system, which forces women to stay in assigned residences, even if they're experiencing violence there. So based on all these findings, which I've summarised quite quickly, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer, we made some policy recommendations, and these are really what we hope the socio-economic or the social, whatever it was, impact of our project is. One of these was to create a state-funded, the government should, or the state should provide a multilingual one-stop source of accessible information for migrant women on different forms of GBV, on legislation, on services and policies. There should be more public education campaigns, again, in different languages and in a variety of venues about GBV, about rights, about resources. And there needs to be education for welfare and migration bureaucracies so that people working in those services really understand the needs and the challenges of migrant women. Even more policy recommendations, clearly based on our findings on the lack of accommodation, but really creating more accommodation places and creating safe spaces for women, so you don't have accommodation centres where everyone's mixed together and women don't even have separate bathrooms or separate access. So really having safe spaces for women. And also making spaces for migrant women. Often we found that migrant women can't access spaces in women's shelters or women's refuges for women victims of violence. So those need to be opened, and they're facilitated that they can have spaces in those refuges if they wish. And really make these connections between people working with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, more general welfare services, and also the police and the judiciary. And then really remove restrictions in immigration law that negatively affect women. So we're thinking about, border controls, immigration laws, and many things. And again, I can go into more details, but that will affect women, migrants, and increase their risk of experiencing SGBV. So these are some of the things we've done. We published a book just last year, which is a collected book with, if you want to read it, it's available, very good read, available in all good booksellers. We made country reports and policy briefs for each country. We've done podcasts, which are all on our website. And we did several conference presentations and articles. This was a picture in the Metropolitis, I can't say it, conference in Berlin, which is a conference that brings together policymakers and researchers. Metropolis, I know, I'm just tired and it's the end of the day. International Metropolis Conference brings together policymakers and researchers, and we thought it was a really good venue. And we did a panel, we had women came and represented groups like Women in Exile, which was great because we had, you know, a real interface between, which is what we want to do, policymakers and these women to really express their experiences and tell what had happened to them. Directions for future research. We want to continue to explore this situated intersectionality and the ways that it produces situations of vulnerability. We really think that our research has a lot of good and practical policy recommendations in each country, but also more broadly and even at an EU level. And we want to carry on our work. We've started with our policy briefs and with some of our conferences, but we want to carry on working more closely with policymakers to see how we can affect change in policy and how these changes really can have an impact. And also creating further participatory research, because one of the things we did was to to work with migrant women and refugee women so they could really talk and tell their stories, and we think that's something also that's really important to develop in the future. And I just want to finish with, this was one of the women who spoke to us who said, it would be very, well, you can read it, but really the whole idea of the research, that these results can reach as many people as possible and have an impact, and that policies and laws can change and reduce the risks of GBV for these women. And then I'm going to stop. And I hope I wasn't too long.